In the late 18th century, the French Revolution shattered the old monarchical order of Europe. But the continent's true transformation would not be complete until the rise of one man, Napoleon Bonaparte. The Napoleonic Wars were not a single conflict, but a series of global military campaigns that raged from 1803 to 1815, involving nearly every major European power. This era was a climax of ideological and military innovation, a period of unprecedented scale and brutality that would forever change the map of Europe and the very idea of nations. From the sun-scorched plains of Egypt to the frozen steppes of Russia, Napoleon's ambition drove a generation of soldiers to war. His military genius carved out a vast empire that stretched across the continent, but his relentless quest for dominance ultimately led to his downfall. The legacy of these wars would be the birth of modern nationalism, the spread of revolutionary ideals, and a new political order that would shape Europe for the next century. So, how did a Corsican artillery officer rise to command an empire? What were the key battles that defined his ascent and his fall? And what were the lasting consequences of a conflict that remade the world in its wake? The rise of Napoleon. From revolution to emperor, the story of the Napoleonic Wars is inseparable from the story of the French Revolution. For a decade, from 1789 to 1799, France was consumed by radical political change, executing its king and establishing a republic. As Europe's conservative monarchies tried to contain the revolution, a series of wars broke out. It was in this cauldron of conflict that Napoleon Bonaparte forged his career. Born on the island of Corsica in 1769, Napoleon was a young, brilliant artillery officer who quickly rose through the ranks of the French Revolutionary Army. His early victories in Italy and Egypt demonstrated his tactical genius and his ability to inspire his troops. By the late 1790s, France's revolutionary government, the Directory, was corrupt and unstable. Napoleon, returning to France as a popular hero, saw his opportunity. In November 1799, he staged the coup of 18 Brumaire, overthrowing the Directory and establishing himself as first consul, the head of a new government. Over the next 5 years, Napoleon consolidated his power and implemented a series of far-reaching reforms that stabilized France. His most enduring achievement was the Napoleonic Code, a comprehensive legal system that guaranteed many of the revolution's principles, such as equality before the law and property rights. These reforms made him immensely popular and paved the way for him to crown himself Emperor of the French in 1804. The great powers and the War of the Third Coalition. Napoleon's imperial ambitions were a direct threat to the established powers of Europe. From the very beginning, a series of coalitions, led by Great Britain, formed against him. The British, with their powerful navy and vast financial resources, were the consistent and implacable enemy of Napoleonic France. They subsidized the armies of Austria, Prussia, and Russia to fight on the continent, while they dominated the seas. The first major phase of the Napoleonic Wars began with the War of the Third Coalition in 1805. Napoleon's initial plan was to invade Britain, but his naval forces were no match for the British Royal Navy. In October 1805, British Admiral Horatio Nelson famously destroyed the combined French and Spanish fleets at the Battle of Trafalgar. This decisive British victory secured naval supremacy for Britain for the rest of the war, ending Napoleon's hopes of invading the island. Despite this naval setback, Napoleon achieved his greatest land victory just 6 weeks later. Marching his army across Europe, he faced the combined forces of Austria and Russia at the Battle of Austerlitz. In a tactical masterpiece, Napoleon lured his enemies into a trap, feigning weakness, and then unleashing a devastating attack that annihilated the Allied armies. This triumph is often considered Napoleon's finest hour, demonstrating his unparalleled skill as a military commander. Austerlitz forced Austria to make peace and dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, cementing Napoleon's dominance over Central Europe. Napoleon's zenith, master of Europe following Austerlitz, Napoleon was the undisputed master of continental Europe. He created a vast French empire, installing his relatives and allies on the thrones of new kingdoms and duchies. His power seemed absolute. In response, the War of the Fourth Coalition began in 1806 when Prussia, alarmed by French power, declared war. Napoleon's response was swift and brutal. He completely crushed the Prussian army at the Battle of Austerlitz in a single day, effectively knocking Prussia out of the war. He then turned his attention to Russia, and after an indecisive but bloody battle, Tsar Alexander I sued for peace. The subsequent Treaty of Tilsit in 1807 marked the peak of Napoleon's power. In a pact with Russia, Napoleon essentially divided Europe between the two empires. At this point, the French Empire and its satellite states controlled a vast territory, stretching from the Atlantic to Poland. With the British Navy controlling the seas, Napoleon attempted to defeat Britain through economic warfare. He instituted the Continental System, a massive embargo designed to cut off all trade between continental Europe and Great Britain. He believed that by destroying Britain's economy, he could force them to the negotiating table. However, this system proved to be a major overreach that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The beginning of the end, overstretch and disaster Napoleon's empire, built on military conquest and political coercion, contained the seeds of its own destruction. Two events, in particular, shattered the myth of his invincibility. The first was the Peninsular War 1808 to 1814. To enforce the continental system, Napoleon invaded Portugal and then occupied Spain. The Spanish people, outraged by the installation of Napoleon's brother on their throne, rose up in a brutal and protracted guerrilla war. This conflict was a massive drain on French resources, tying down hundreds of thousands of French troops for years. It was in Spain that British forces, under the command of the Duke of Wellington, would first gain a foothold on the continent, systematically wearing down the French army. Napoleon himself called the Peninsular War his Spanish ulcer. Napoleon's ultimate disaster came in 1812 with the invasion of Russia. Angered by Russia's withdrawal from the continental system, Napoleon assembled the largest European army ever seen, the Grande Army, of over 600,000 men. The campaign was an unmitigated catastrophe. The Russians employed a scorched earth policy, retreating and burning crops and villages to deny the French army supplies. After a bloody and indecisive battle at Borodino, Napoleon captured Moscow, only to find the city in flames. With Winterfest approaching and his supply lines stretched to a breaking point, Napoleon was forced to order a devastating retreat. The brutal Russian winter, disease, and constant guerrilla attacks from Cossacks decimated the Grande Army. Of the hundreds of thousands who had invaded, only a tiny fraction survived, a ruinous loss of manpower that France could never recover from. The final defeat and legacy Napoleon's defeat in Russia emboldened his enemies. In 1813, a sixth coalition of Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria united against him. Napoleon was finally defeated in the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of the Nations, the largest battle in Europe before World War I. Facing invasion, Napoleon was forced to abdicate his throne in 1814 and was exiled to the tiny island of Elba. However, Napoleon's story was not yet over. In a dramatic turn of events, he escaped from Elba in 1815 and returned to France to a rapturous welcome. This period, known as the 100 Days, saw him briefly regain power. The European powers responded by assembling a new coalition army. In June 1815, in what would be his final battle, Napoleon's army was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo by a combined force of British and Prussian armies, led by the Duke of Wellington and Field Marshal Blücher. Following his defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon was exiled to the remote South Atlantic island of St. Helena, where he died in 1821. The Napoleonic Wars left an indelible mark on Europe. They led to the rise of nationalism, as peoples who had been conquered by Napoleon developed a shared identity and a desire for self-rule. The wars also spread the ideals of the French Revolution across Europe, leading to legal and administrative reforms in many countries. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 redrew the map of Europe, seeking to restore the old order and create a balance of power, but it could not erase the revolutionary ideas that Napoleon had unleashed. The Napoleonic Wars marked the end of the old Europe and the birth of a new, modern, and often volatile world.